I never thought I would live to see the day when Japan, the nation that had been bound by its pacifist constitution for nearly 8 decades, would stand up and declare itself ready to go to war in order to shatter China's 5 greatest strategic ambitions. But that day has arrived. The violent threat from a Chinese diplomat demanding that Japan's prime minister be beheaded was not some meaningless emotional outburst. It was a signal that Beijing has entered its most dangerous moment. The moment when it believes war is no longer an option, but the inevitable path to seizing its dream of hegemony. And Tokyo understands the meaning of that signal better than anyone. Japan's response was not a symbolic statement. When they said, if China attacks Taiwan, Japan will intervene, they tore up 70 years of strategic ambiguity live on television, sending a crystal-clear message. China's Pacific encirclement will be stopped at its very starting point. What truly startled Beijing was not the words themselves, but the reality that Japan actually has the capability to turn those words into blows. And for Washington, what is even more frightening is realizing that this moment did not emerge from a vacuum. It was China's rise and years of American underestimation of Tokyo's resolve that brought us here. For the first time since the end of World War II, the region the United States once overwhelmingly dominated now faces the risk of a severe power imbalance. This is not just about threats between two East Asian nations. This is the moment of truth in American foreign policy, a reminder that power, once challenged, always seeks to reassert itself through dangerous paths. Let me explain why Japan is preparing to turn the Pacific into the battlefield that will stop an ambition China can no longer hide. China is driving itself toward war, and I want to be perfectly clear. You cannot understand what is happening unless you look inside the Forbidden City, where Xi Jinping has just carried out a massive purge to eliminate every last braking mechanism inside the PLA. I'm not saying this based on speculation. The only generals who dared tell him, "We are not ready to take on Japan and the United States," have been dragged from their posts, stripped of command, investigated, or simply disappeared. When a leader removes everyone who warns about risk and keeps only those willing to nod, it means he is clearing the way for the one option he still believes in, the use of force. And from a strategic perspective, I see one thing very clearly. An army with no one left to say stop is an army sliding straight toward war. Everything US. And Japanese intelligence is observing matches that assessment. Along the coasts of Fujian and Guangdong, China is expanding bases at a pace that would alarm any military expert. Missile silos are being dug deep to survive preemptive strikes. Fuel depots are being massively expanded, airfields are ballooning in size, and new tunnels running straight to the sea are under construction day and night. No country does this just to send diplomatic messages. This is infrastructure for a real campaign capable of lasting weeks or months. In parallel, I've tracked the PLA conducting more than 200 amphibious assault simulations in a single year. The scenarios have completely changed. These are no longer pressure exercises. They are full-scale rehearsals for attack, establishing beachheads, seizing landing zones, and breaking through defenses in the shortest possible time before America and Japan can respond. They are preparing for a lightning strike on Taiwan. In the skies, China is testing the newest generations of the DF-21D and DF-26 missiles designed to hit American carriers or Japanese destroyers from nearly 1,000 kilometers away. I see no other purpose for this system than to neutralize U.S. intervention capability in the very first hours of conflict. And on the economic front, Beijing is behaving exactly like a nation preparing for blockade. Gold reserves are at record levels, strategic oil and gas stockpiles are the largest in history, and food and industrial metals are being hoarded on a scale only seen in countries about to face sanctions. I've studied many military campaigns, and I can tell you straight, these stockpiling patterns are war preparations, not economic recovery. Meanwhile, shipyards are launching Type 075 and Type 071 vessels at an unprecedented rate. These ships are built to carry thousands of troops and vehicles, not for parades, but to cross the Taiwan Strait in a full-scale invasion. When I put all the data on the table, the picture is anything but ambiguous. If China wants to achieve its 5 greatest strategic goals, unifying Taiwan, breaking the first island chain, pushing the US out of the Western Pacific, gaining access to the deep ocean, and becoming Asia's hegemon, peace will not get them there. That is why they are preparing for war. And I want to emphasize this. A confident China can negotiate, but a cornered China, when all its ambitions are blocked by a rising Japan and a US, Japan-Korea alliance is always the most dangerous. China. Once Xi Jinping has personally removed every break inside the PLA, the question is no longer whether they will strike. The real question is, which moment will they choose when they believe America and Japan are most vulnerable? While China slides into a war trajectory, Japan, after 7 decades of restraint, has finally awakened, and I want to explain this very clearly. Tokyo's rise is not an emotional reaction. It is the inevitable consequence of survival logic in a strategic environment that has become the most dangerous since the end of World War II. It all began when Japan produced a leader no one in the region ever thought they would see. A tough prime minister, hardline in both words and policy, unapologetic, unwavering, and unwilling to follow the well-worn path of previous generations of Japanese leaders. She looked straight at China and uttered the sentence that every strategist immediately recognized as historic: Japan has entered a new era. The statement, "If Taiwan falls, Japan falls," is not a slogan. It is an accurate description of how the strategic environment actually works. When you study power politics the way I have for decades, you understand this. Nations do not act out of morality, they act out of survival. And for Japan, losing Taiwan means losing strategic position, losing naval operating space, losing energy security, and ultimately losing autonomy. In a system where China is accelerating, Japan has no choice but to prepare for the worst-case scenario. What makes this moment historic is that Japan, for the first time, has invoked the concept of a survival threat, an existential threat to the nation, something that previously existed only on paper and had never been activated. Under Japanese law, once an event is classified as a survival threat, every legal barrier that has kept the self-defense forces locked down is nullified. Japan can intervene militarily even if it has not itself been attacked. And when the Prime Minister declared that Taiwan's collapse would trigger this clause, she was not just sending a message to Beijing, she was unlocking Japan's full geostrategic power, a power the world had forgotten because Tokyo had been shackled for 70 years. Let me be blunt. Japan has ended decades of strategic ambiguity. No more, "we are concerned," "we are monitoring the situation," or "we hope for peace." Instead, there is direct deterrence language. If China attacks, Japan will fight back. And for American viewers watching this, here is what you need to understand right now. Japan is no longer a dependent ally. It is becoming an equal partner, a new power center in the Indo-Pacific security architecture. This does not just change Tokyo's status. It forces the United States to recalibrate its strategy. For years, Washington grew comfortable seeing Japan as the defensive shield sitting behind America. But now Japan is placing itself on the front line, ready to act independently to protect its vital interests. And I want you to see this through the lens of power. When an economic superpower like Japan allows itself to transform into a military superpower, the regional balance shifts completely. They no longer wait for America to decide. They prepare first, deter first, and are ready to fight first. That is why China is afraid. That is why the region is shaking. And that is why the moment Japan awakens marks the end of the 70-year illusion of peace, because in Tokyo's eyes, war is no longer a distant possibility. It is a real scenario, and they are preparing for it with all the power history once forced them to hide. Japan has not merely awakened. It is acting like a great power that understands exactly what it is facing. And what has surprised many is that Tokyo is not only looking south where China is accelerating its military buildup but is also staring straight north and has decided to deliver a double blow against both Beijing and Moscow at the same time. From a strategic perspective, I can tell you this is one of the smartest and boldest moves Japan has made since 1945, and it shows they will no longer accept passivity in the biggest geopolitical game of the 21st century. In the south, Japan is sending direct deterrence signals to China, deploying long-range radars, intensifying patrols, fortifying forward islands, and openly declaring the possibility of military intervention if Beijing attacks Taiwan. But what really unnerves China is not just Tokyo's words or posture. It is the way Japan has decided to strike at the weakest link in Beijing's strategic plan, Russia. Tokyo understands that China cannot sustain a war over Taiwan alone while under simultaneous pressure from the U.S. and Japan. Beijing needs the northern energy lifeline, the cheap crude oil and gas Russia supplies, to keep its economy and military running if war breaks out. And Japan has decided to hit that point directly. They have banned Russia's shadow fleet, the network of old, unregistered tankers that carry sanction-evading oil from all Japanese waters. Strategically, this is a strike at Moscow's remaining economic artery. Russia depends almost entirely on this route to fund its war in Ukraine and maintain domestic stability. When Tokyo slammed shut the sea lanes those ships must use, Japan did not just choke Russia's war budget, it also undermined China's contingency energy plan in case of blockade by the US and its allies. I want you to see the connection here. A depleted Russia in the Pacific is not just Moscow's failure, it is a strategic risk for Beijing. If the energy pipeline is strangled, China must fight fast and win fast, or accept war, while resource-starved, a scenario they cannot tolerate. And Japan knows it. That is precisely why Tokyo delivered the double blow. The Japanese are not acting in a vacuum. They are acting because they understand the larger plan China is building. In October, NATO warned that Beijing might use Russia as a strategic smokescreen, pushing Moscow to create pressure in Europe to divide America's attention when China strikes Taiwan. Japan did not just hear that warning, they decided to destroy that entire strategic structure before it could take shape. In the north, Tokyo has stepped up air defense activities, surveillance of the Russian fleet, anti-intrusion exercises, and rapid response training near the Kuril Islands. They are sending Moscow a clear signal. Any military move to support China will be met with stronger economic and military countermeasures. In the south, Japan is deploying upgraded air defense systems, increasing the presence of Aegis destroyers, and integrating more tightly with the U.S. to ensure China cannot gain an advantage before the alliance can respond. When you look at the entire picture, what I want American viewers to understand is this. Japan has acted like a true great power. They are no longer sitting back to see what China will do. They have proactively shattered the Sino-Russian coordination plan that Beijing had placed enormous hope in. Japan understands perfectly well. If China starts a war over Taiwan, Russia will certainly create a disturbance in Europe to split American forces. And the only way to prevent that is to preemptively strike at this strategic combination before it becomes reality. This is pure power logic, and Tokyo has executed it precisely, coldly, and with ruthless calculation. Japan is no longer standing behind the United States as a passive ally. They are becoming a power capable of shaping the chessboard itself, and the double blow they delivered against both Beijing and Moscow is the clearest proof that the Pacific Order has changed not by words, but by deeds. Japan has not only delivered a double blow to China and Russia, they have done something I believe will be written into strategy textbooks for decades to come. They have launched the largest military acceleration since 1945, and I want you to visualize the scale of this turning point. For 40 years, Japan voluntarily bound itself to the 1% GDP defense spending cap, a symbolic constraint that they would never return to the path of military power. But now Tokyo has shattered that ceiling. Not gently, but with a decisive leap. Defense spending increased by more than 10%, with the goal of reaching the NATO 2% standard by 2027. This is not just more money, it is a declaration that Japan will never allow China to gain regional superiority. And as the money starts flowing into military projects, the world is witnessing the rise of a new, dangerous, and highly organized force. Let's start with Tomahawk. Japan has ordered 400 Tomahawk Block V missiles from the United States, the modern version capable of striking fixed and moving targets up to 1,600 kilometers away. From Japan's coast, Tomahawks can hit missile bases, logistics depots, command centers, and airfields all along China's coastline. It puts every critical PLA facility from Fujian to Guangdong within range. And the strategy behind it is crystal clear. Instead of waiting for China to strike, Japan wants the ability to neutralize the PLA's logistics structure in the very first minute of war. But Tomahawk is only part of it. Tokyo has deployed Type 03 Chusam systems to Yonaguni Island, Japan's southwesternmost point, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan's coast. And I want to emphasize, 110 kilometers is strategic distance. From Yonaguni, Japanese radar can scan the entire airspace east of Taiwan, tracking every fighter, every transport aircraft, every cruise missile heading toward the island. This deployment effectively blockades the eastern side of Taiwan, the route China hoped to use as a backdoor to encircle the island. The PLA calls that route the Eastern Encirclement Route, the path they need to reach the open Pacific and avoid U.S. Japan intervention. Now it is gone. A single, well-placed Chu-Sam system can lock down the sky, making any attempt to encircle Taiwan from the east impossible. Japan has cut China's strategy in half with one deployment move, but Tokyo is not stopping at defense. They are developing hypersonic weapons, the kind only 3 countries in the world are racing to perfect: the United States, China, and Russia. What matters is that tests in California have already succeeded. When made in Japan, hypersonic missiles enter service, they will fly low, faster than Mach 5, with constantly changing trajectories leaving Chinese missile defenses no chance to intercept. For the PLA, this creates a strategic nightmare. They will not know from where, with what, or when Japan will strike. Now shift to submarines. For years, Japan has quietly developed extremely silent AIP and lithium-ion-powered submarines, now armed with long-range missiles launched from torpedo tubes. This turns them into silent killers, hiding inside the first island chain. On every dive, these submarines can track and disrupt any Chinese attempt to break through the chain. It is no coincidence that China fears Japanese submarines more than American ones. They are smaller, quieter, faster, and specifically designed to fight in shallow coastal waters, where the Chinese Navy is at a clear disadvantage. But perhaps the biggest and most important for American audiences game changer is the birth of the Japan Joint Operations Command. This structure is directly modeled on the U.S. Joint Operations Command. For the first time in history, Japan's Army, Navy, Air Force, Space, and Cyber Forces are placed under a single command center with real-time data integration. This solves Japan's greatest weakness of the past 7 decades: force fragmentation and lack of unity in combat. From now on, Japan can respond in minutes instead of hours. The U.S. has helped overhaul the entire communications system, share radar data, and coordinate fires. U.S. Forces Japan USFJ has also been restructured to be fully compatible with the Japanese system, meaning in war, the U.S. and Japan will operate as a single fighting force. No more gaps between the two machines, no more coordination delays, no more command vulnerabilities. None of these changes are accidental. They all aim at one very clear objective: to destroy China's 5 greatest strategic ambitions. First, China cannot unify Taiwan if Japan has both the right and the capability to block the eastern approach. Second, China cannot break out into the Pacific if it has to run through Japanese fire. Third, China cannot dislodge the U.S. from the first island chain if that chain has become a Japanese fortress. Fourth, China cannot control Japan's trade routes if Japan has tomahawks, hypersonics, and missile-firing submarines pointing in every direction. Finally, China cannot become Asia's hegemon if Japan has returned as a full-fledged military great power. This is a complete reversal of the entire balance of power. And it marks the moment when Japan, for the first time in 80 years, is not merely defending itself, but actively shaping the regional order with real hard power. But to understand why Japan is willing to do all this, you have to look deeper into the historical geology lying beneath every strategic decision Tokyo makes, because the confrontation between Japan and China is not a current dispute. It is a centuries-long undercurrent fed by memory, hatred, and fear that both sides carry. China has built its modern political identity on anti-Japanese nationalism. In every textbook, every movie, every political speech, Japan is portrayed as the historical aggressor that must be stopped and paid back. That obsession has become part of the propaganda system, helping Beijing legitimize its power and rally public support whenever it needs to stoke tension. And I want you to understand this clearly. A nation that nurtures hatred as a political tool will always slide into war more easily than one that does not. For Japan, historical memory does not operate through propaganda, but through very real fear for national security. They know that if Taiwan falls to China, the next step will not be peace. The Senkakus will be the first target, followed by Okinawa, the home of America's most important base in the Western Pacific. Tokyo sees the pattern China usually follows, expanding its sphere by seizing strategic points, gradually pushing rivals out of the island chain. Taiwan's fall is not just the loss of one island, it is the loss of the natural defensive wall separating Japan from China. Once that wall collapses, Tokyo will be naked before Beijing's military and political pressure, and Japan understands that better than anyone. But what drives Tokyo to act even more decisively is not just history or geopolitics, it is the cold economic truth. 90% of Japan's energy, including oil and LNG, travels through sea lanes right next to Taiwan. If China controls Taiwan, it has the power to collapse Japan's economy without firing a single bullet. When you depend on imported energy to run every industry, every factory, every city, losing freedom of navigation is nothing less than a death sentence. Japan cannot accept that, and no rational country would. So when China accelerates militarily, Japan does not see a new rival. They see the return of a familiar ghost, one that history shows will swallow the entire region if not stopped early. Historical hatred is only the surface. What lies beneath is the reality that these two nations are two civilizations in direct competition for control of East Asia. They share the same strategic space, the same sea lanes, the same regional influence goals, and that makes conflict almost inevitable. When one side, China, is trying to change the order by force, while the other, Japan, must defend its position to survive. What I want to emphasize is this: Japan is not preparing for war because it wants to be a great power again like before. They are doing it because the logic of survival forces them to. This is not a moral game where Tokyo chooses to stand on the right side. This is a fight where if Taiwan falls, Japan loses security. If Japan loses security, it loses its economy. And if it loses its economy, it loses the nation. When you look through that lens, you will see why Japan has thrown off 70 years of restraint. They are not choosing war for honor or principle. They are preparing for war because it is the only way to survive in an Asia where China is growing at a speed and with an ambition never seen before. When we put all the pieces together, Japan's rearmament, the purges inside the PLA, the double blow against the China-Russia axis, and the heavy shadow of history, we clearly see a new order forming in Asia, and its outcome will decide America's role in the 21st century. Japan has become the strongest military power in East Asia after the United States. This is no longer a prediction, it is reality. Skyrocketing defense budget, long-range weapons, hypersonics, Joint Operations Command, stealth submarines, and preemptive strike capability, all turning Tokyo into a center of power that even Beijing must now calculate every move against. At the same time, China is sliding rapidly toward the decision to attack, not because they want war, but because they believe time is no longer on their side. The window of opportunity to unify Taiwan, break the first island chain, and push the U.S. out of the Western Pacific is closing day by day as Japan accelerates faster than they anticipated. And that is why Beijing increasingly sees war not as an option, but as a strategic imperative. Nations that fall into that position are always the most dangerous, and China is standing exactly there. As for Russia, Beijing's supposedly no-limits ally, it has ultimately become a pawn to be sacrificed. Russia is economically strangled in the Pacific and unable to help China beyond words. Once Japan locked the door, Russia lost the ability to play the fire-splitting role that would force America to divide its attention. The sad reality for Moscow is that they entered this alliance looking for strength, but are being turned into a shock absorber in the China-Japan U.S. confrontation. And now we come to the most important question for Washington. Where does the United States stand in this picture? I will say this straight, and I say it as someone who has spent an entire career studying the logic of power. America needs to prepare for the possibility of fighting on two fronts at once. If China attacks Taiwan, it is highly likely some disturbance in Europe, triggered by Russia, will force the U.S. to split its forces. No superpower in history has ever liked fighting on two fronts, but if Washington is not prepared, China will exploit that moment to achieve its greatest victory, pushing the United States out of the Western Pacific. In that context, Japan becomes the pillar of the alliance. This is no longer a U.S. protects, Japan assists relationship. This is a new era. Japan is the frontline force, the equal partner, the nation that can hold the line while America maneuvers. In other words, if the U.S. wants to preserve the regional order, it needs a strong Japan. And the reality is that Japan is getting strong at a speed even Washington did not expect. But on the flip side, if America does not stand with Japan when war comes, China will win in the long run. An Asia-Pacific where Taiwan falls and Japan is encircled will quickly become a region where the U.S. is reduced to a secondary role. And once America loses its position in the Western Pacific, it loses the ability to shape global economics, security, and technology. Therefore, in this century, No decision is more important for the United States than choosing to stand firmly in alliance with Japan. That is the choice between remaining a superpower or becoming a regional power. And when everything is put in its proper place, you will clearly see what I mean. The new order is being written right now. Japan no longer bows its head. China no longer hides its ambitions. Russia no longer has the capacity to play a major role. And the United States must decide whether it will be the main player or a spectator in this new era. In the shadows of the Pacific, the swords have already been drawn, and those who still believe in peace simply do not understand the logic of power. Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the next geopolitical analyses.